This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is a senior fellow at the Leer Institute and a historian of modern Palestine. His latest book, called Nakba and Survival, the story of the Palestinians who remained in Haifa and the Galilee, 1948 to 1956, has been published in Hebrew earlier this year and in Arabic in Beirut and Ramallah shortly before that. Dr. Adel Manna is joining us today. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello.
So the story of your family is really a quintessential example of the story that you tell in the book. Give us a bit of your background story. How did your family, originally from the Galilee village of Majd al-Krum, manage to stay in Israel after 1948, while more than 700,000 of your compatriots had to flee?
Well, it's a long and complicated story. I'll try to make it short. Our village was occupied, actually surrendered, at the end of October 48. In the so-called Hiram operation. And in the first week, nothing bad happened to the people of the village because there was an agreement of surrender that the people of the village will transfer their weapons to the army and they will stay put and nothing bad will happen to them. And that unit respected that agreement. However, a week after, another unit came from another direction. I know as a historian it was a Golani unit. And they claimed that the people of the village did not transfer all of their arms. And they ordered the notables to bring those hidden arms within an hour. Otherwise, they'll start execute one man in another half an hour. So on that day, there was a massacre. It was on the 5th of November, a week after the surrender of the village. And 8 to 9 people were killed. 5 of them shot by the army each half an hour. But then a commander came from Nahariya, from the Haganah, from the Shai, and he stopped the massacre. Otherwise, it would be much worse. 3 months later, the army came again and asked all the people to come to a court in the village. And they said that some of the people infiltrated into the village lately. And they started questioning the men. In the end of that day, the army expelled 536 people from the village. In trucks, it was in 2 shuttles each week, each Friday. So all in all, 536 people, including my family.
To Lebanon?
No, not exactly. Including my family, which is my father, my mother, and myself as 1-year-old child. We were kicked out to Wadi Ara, which was in the hands of the King Abdullah army. From there, we walked toward some of the people toward Jenin, others toward Nablus. My family went to Nablus, to a refugee camp. We stayed there about 3 months until April, from January 49 to April 49. Then the Jordanians themselves told the people, you shouldn't stay here. Why you don't go to Lebanon and from there try to go back to your villages. And that's what many people did. So we made all the way to East Jordan, to Syria, to Lebanon, and we came in the end of the road to Ain al-Hilwe, not far.
The promised land of Ain al-Hilwe.
Yeah, to Ain al-Hilwe, near Sidon, Saida. And we stayed there more than 2 years, until summer 51, My father was crossing the border and visiting his mom because the army didn't expel all the people of the village. They expelled mainly young men between the age, let's say, of 16, 17 to 30. I believe they thought also that the elders will go after them, but it didn't happen. So he was visiting his mom, and he knew in 51, before the elections, second elections in Israel in 51, that it's easier lately to come back and to get ID card. So he went back to the refugee camp and told my mom, we are going back to the village.
So your father was lucky because he already registered
Exactly.
in Israel, so he was able to come back.
Exactly, yeah.
Because, when we think about the early years, the late 40s, the early 50s, you would think that the Israelis were very pleased with the absence of the majority of Palestinians, and they will do whatever they can not to allow them back.
Sure.
But as you say, it happened. It was it was possible to cross the border. So the reason that there weren't more people who did that was because your father had an Israeli citizenship?
There was no citizenship at that time. The law of citizenship was issued only in 52. However, people got ID numbers, not ID cards themselves, but slips with number. So the census of population in our village was in December, about 1 month and a half after the surrender of the village. And I know the dates, I put it in the book. So since my father and my mother and myself had ID numbers, so a lawyer in 51 went to the court and said that those people were expelled and they are coming back. They were expelled illegally, and that's why the Minister of Interior should give them ID card. Their expulsion was illegal, so the government should give them ID card. And he succeeded in the court, and that's why it was a precedent where other people who came back from Lebanon or elsewhere were able to go even to the Ministry of Interior to say, here, we have ID number, give us ID card.
It's a very interesting trajectory considering, I don't know if our listeners know, but Ain al-Khilwe is a refugee camp in Lebanon where people are living to this day. And do you think about that? I mean, it seems like probably just a very small portion of the people were actually able to come back, certainly because of Israel's policies, which you document in the book as well. Do you think about these different paths that your life took because your family left Ain al-Khilwe and those who stayed there?
I thought about that all the time since I have been 10 years old. My father told me this story of the expulsion and coming back in summer 51 when I was in grade 4. I was 10 years old, and since that time, consistently I thought about this because my uncle, the brother of my father, stayed in Ain al-Khilwe. He didn't come with his family, and my father told us the story. And since that time, I thought that we were lucky to be living again in our home, having back our lands, and not living in Ain al-Khilwe in a refugee camp with all the stories that I heard from my mother, from my father, about the atrocities and about the living conditions in a refugee camp in Ain al-Khilwe in this particular case.
Let's move a little bit away from your personal story for now. I mean, your book fits into a body of literature over the last couple of decades. Maybe our listeners might be most familiar with Benny Morris's books showing that expulsion policies or de facto actions of Israel were happening already before 48, during the 48 war, and as you write about, following 48 and through the early 1950s. Can you somehow try to give us the boundaries of the time period during which Israel was implementing policies of expulsion? I mean, this is a very sensitive issue, of course, in Israeli life. How do you see it?
If we are speaking about the 1948 war, because before that there was no state of Israel, there was no entity, a Jewish entity. So we can't speak about the period before 48 because the war or some events started just in December.
Right, well, I really mean late 1947.
Yeah, so it's mainly from April 48 on. There were some incidents of attacking villages and people, fleeing and running away. But it started with the Plan D, and with occupation and expulsion of people from late March, early April 48. My book is focusing on Haifa and the Galilee, so I didn't speak much about other areas in the center of the country and in the southern part of the country. If we speak about the Galilee, we have many cases of expulsion from the eastern part of the Galilee. That part was occupied by the Israeli Haganah and other forces already in April 48. Tiberias, for instance, the first city to be occupied, and people of Tiberias were expelled from the city, but all the villages in its vicinity. And then in the area of Safad and in other areas, the people of the mid-Galilee and western Galilee were relatively lucky because of two reasons. One, that their area was occupied later on, not in April, May, but in July and in late October. Now, at that time, Israel was safe. I mean, it was clear at that time that the Arab armies are not succeeding, in the war. And I think there were other reasons that I speak about them in the book, like the mixture of the population in that area of the Galilee. There were Druzes who decided already in May, to cross sides and to fight with the Haganah rather than with Arabs and Palestinians. So they had an agreement that all of their villages will stay put and nothing bad will happen to them. There were Christians in Nazareth and other villages, and Ben Gurion and the Israeli government was much more sensitive to reactions in the West, the churches, the Rome, the Vatican, if they will do the same thing, expulsion and massacres in those villages. So because of those reasons and other reasons that I speak about them in the book, people in the lower Galilee and in the upper Galilee remained in this area much more than any other area in the country, but even in comparison to Eastern Galilee or the seashore area.
It was interesting what you pointed out about Nazareth, this consciousness of the Western world. Do you think that set a pattern of the Israeli policy dealing differently with Christians and Muslims over the years?
For sure.
But it started out because of the concern about Western appearances in the West of what Israel was doing?
There is sensitivity toward Israel needed the support of the West. Without the support of the West in the UN and other institutions, Israel could not sustain its state. But in addition to that, Israel had a policy of having agreements, a collaboration with minorities in the Middle East, like Druze and Christians. For instance, Ben Gurion and the Yishuv leaders tried at least to have good relations with the leaders of the Druze, even in Jabal al-Druze in Syria, in the Atrash family, the famous Atrash family, and with the Christians, the Maronites in Lebanon. Some of those leaders even thought that Israel will not be the only religious state in the region. So there will be a Maronite state in Lebanon, a Jewish state, and maybe a Druze state.
And maybe a Kurdish state.
And maybe a Kurdish state. So we are jumping from...
No, but we see the roots of some of the current policies.
That's right. So there was a differentiation in the attitude toward the Muslims. The bulk of the population are the Muslims. The leaders of the Palestinian national movement are Muslims. So they were viewed as the enemy, while other minorities are not pure enemy. It's possible maybe to collaborate with them, to cooperate with them. And that's what the leadership tried to do already in the 30s. And in the 48, they were still sensitive toward the West and, thinking that it's possible to collaborate with those minorities.
I want to go back to some of the story itself and the actual work, your work as a historian of collecting the material and evidence. Clearly, this is a very controversial issue to this day in Israel. And as Dalia said, and you write in the book, the way was paved in many ways by Benny Morris and other historians who were the first to unveil the real story of 1948. But he, as you also write in the book, relies heavily on Israeli sources, on the Haganah archives, etc. And as you say, it maintains and perpetuates the power imbalance between the parties, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So tell us a bit about the actual methodology of how you wanted to address that power imbalance, and what actual methods you employed to reconstitute the story of the Palestinians.
Well, one of the new things in my book is that it gives voice to those people who nobody wrote about them. Nobody told their stories, not only from the Israeli side, but even from the Palestinian side, because most of what have been written about the Palestinians and the Palestine question, either in the Nakba or earlier period or later period, was written by the elite, the township elite, the urban elites, while the majority of the population, the peasants, the fallahin, who were 2/3 of the population, of the Palestinian population, and are the majority of the refugees also, not much have been written about them. So I decided, because of my personal knowledge and because I found as a historian that nobody wrote this story to begin with about those who remained, not those who became refugees. Second, not about the cities, but rather about the peasant area, So I decided to go to the Arab sources, all the Arab sources that most of the Israelis don't know about them. Some of those historians who wrote about 48 and after don't know Arabic at all, like Benny Morris. So he doesn't use at all Arab sources. And it's quite weird that a historian who's writing about a conflict between two nations, two societies, only the language of one side. He doesn't know the language and the sources of the other side. So the knowledge of the three languages, at least, Arabic, Hebrew, and English, and consulting all the sources from all parties, the Israeli side, the British side, and the Palestinian side, in addition to oral history, which I used in the book, and I found it very important, gave this book, a new methodology, a new data that we don't have in either Benny Morris's book or other new historians or classical historians who wrote about the 48 and after.
Did you unveil new massacres and new things that we didn't know existed that added to the corpus of the historiography of 1948?
Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily. There are few massacres that I speak about them that Benny Morris and others didn't speak about them. But this is not the main story of the book. The story of the book, main story of the book, is about the survival, staying. Not because most of the places where massacre took place became refugees. And I didn't write about those massacres at all because those people became refugees. I'm not going to repeat the story of the refugee, the birth of the refugee problem, and so on and so forth. I decided to ask new questions that Benny Morris and others didn't ask. My question was, how come that those people remained? Because it's clear that if not a master plan of expelling the Palestinians, at least the Jewish leaders imagined Palestine as a Jewish state without Palestinians at all, or as less Palestinians as possible. So it was clear that the common good of Zionism, of the Zionists, was a Jewish state with a small number of Palestinians. So then the question is, after all the massacres and all what happened from the early 48 up to October 48, how come that many people stayed in their places? And those are the questions that I'm asking in the book and trying to find out the complexity of the circumstances which led to the result that relatively many people stayed in the Galilee. That question wasn't answered neither by Morris or Ilan Pappy or other historians, and that's what I'm saying, that this book is telling a different story, though it's speaking about 48 and after.
Yeah, I want to go back to that point about the sources. It's not just the Arabic language that gives you a different perspective than the other historians. It's this concept of oral history, too. It's very interesting that oral history has often been used in understanding the Palestinian story of the refugees. Why is it a popular or an important and central medium in academic research about Palestinians, and now you're bringing it to the study of Palestinians in Israel?
We know from, history of other peoples and other areas, that victors are writing the history. And in this case, it's clear-cut case where the Israelis wrote the history of the war, of the refugees, of both sides of conflict. Palestinians lost their homeland, lost their homes, their lands, their libraries, their archives, if they had collective archives or personal archives. And today, there is very few archives, if at all, from the Palestinian side. So if you don't use Palestinian archive, if you don't have enough sources from the Palestinian side, and you don't use oral history, you can't write the point of view of those people who became, the victims of what happened in 48. Refugees or something else. So oral history is very important. And we know about other cases in Jewish history, like the Holocaust and other cases, where without listening to the stories of the victims, you can't tell a complete story. It's a partial story. And that's what we have about 48, about the refugees and about those who remained, because the Israeli side are not taking into account the Palestinian sources, including oral history. The Palestinian side are writing from their own sources without knowing Hebrew, most of them, and without taking into account, at least enough, the Israeli sources or the Hebrew sources.
Now I'd like to focus on some of the protagonists of your book, and by that I mean the Arab communists that are covered at length. Because I think that in many ways their story encapsulates the story of the survival, because they were a negligible minority up until 1948. Right. And the reason they were negligible and also almost excluded from the community was that the Communist Party at the time and the Soviet Union supported the partition plan, and therefore they supported the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, of Israel, and after a certain point, as you write in the book, they actively supported it. Is this really, to your mind as well, the story of survival, from being a very negligible minority to becoming a force to be reckoned with politically within the community of survivors? After having made these very difficult decisions about effectively betraying your national cause?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's a very important question concerning the third chapter in the book about the communists and their survival in Israel and becoming the leaders of the Palestinians who remained in Israel, as we know. Now, this chapter had the most feedback among the Arab readers. Among the Hebrew readers, they know much about the Communist Party because the Jewish communists told their stories. They were proud in what they did in 48. Actually, some of them, like Mikunis himself, he said that he was more patriot than Ben-Gurion himself, that he had more role in establishing the state of Israel, more even than Ben-Gurion, and so on and so forth. It's an exaggeration. However, he was proud, at least. He and others were proud in what they did. The case of the Palestinian communists was different. They didn't write about what they did in 48. They told a narrative totally different from what happened in 48. They said, okay, we accepted the division plan, and that was wise to accept the division plan, but they didn't say what they did during the war. And they jumped from accepting the division plan into 49 and after, speaking about being the heroes of the struggle against the military regime in the Arab areas, expropriation of lands, and so on and so forth. So they have this narrative of being heroes from the beginning until the 70s and after. And I knew a little bit about the weapons brought from Czechoslovakia, from Prague in February 48 and after. I knew about...
To the Israeli side.
To the Israeli side, about the support of the Soviet Union to Israel and so on, militarily, politically, and so on. And I decided to study what the communists did and what they said in 48. So actually the first source that I started to read was the newspaper Al-Ittihad in Arabic of the Communist Party. And I was stunned that they were so Israeli patriotic. They believed that Israel will be a socialist country. They believed that Israel will be a friend of the Soviet Union and the communist world, and so on and so forth. And they were so proud that they supported the establishment of Israel. When they spoke about the occupation of the Galilee by the Israeli side, they were speaking almost about liberating the Galilee. While when the Galilee was under Arab control, they spoke as if when the Galilee was under control of the enemy. So that was stunning for me. And then I read more and more sources, both from the communists and others. And then I interviewed some of the communist leaders who were still alive. And in the beginning, they didn't want to speak much about it. And they said, we don't remember, we weren't leaders, and so on and so forth. But little by little, I found out that actually they are not so proud about their role in 48, but they don't want to speak about it. They want to speak about their role from 49 or 50 on, but not about 48.
I want to go back to one of the terms and themes that is a very important part of your book, the idea of survivors. The book we were reading it in Hebrew, and it's a different word, but when I think about it in English, survivors, we can't help but make the association with the very, very prominent narrative in Israel of Holocaust survivors. Were you conscious of that? Were you trying to, in a way, convey these were people who survived a colossal catastrophe, or to convey that this event in Palestinian history has the same sort of resonance as this traumatic event in Jewish history, or am I completely making that up?
I am aware that some of the Jewish readers, the Hebrew readers, will make that connection and comparison. However, when I speak about survival, as we know in Arabic, in Hebrew, and in English, survival is not only survival of a Holocaust or a genocide. It's survival of any catastrophe. It could be an earthquake, it could be a war, and you survive. You survive the catastrophe, and you find the ways, the tools, the tactics, how to survive. And actually, most of the book, the first, second, and third chapters are about the period of the war. But then the other 4 chapters are about the survival after the war. So the question was how those people survived the tragic events themselves, and then the Israeli policies toward them, living under military control with all the imposition of different laws that prevents you from moving from one place to other place, expropriating your land, and so on and so forth, wasn't easy. But actually it's even more than that, because Israel, until 56, many leaders, not everybody, but many leaders in the Israeli side thought that if the refugees, the Palestinian refugees, will be settled in the Arab countries, it will be possible for Israel to push out those 150, 160 Palestinians who remained in Israel. And we know that there were cases where Israel expelled Palestinians from Israel in 49, in 50, Ashkelon, Majd al-Asqalan. They were expelled. Benny Morris himself wrote about their case. In October 50, they expelled about 2,000, 3,000 from the small city of Majd al-Asqalan to Gaza in October 50, much later than the end of the war. But there were even cases in 56 of expulsion of Palestinians, like the two cases that I bring in the book, the two villages of Krad al-Baqqara and Krad al-Ghannami in the Hula area in the north in the Galilee. And who did that? Yitzhak Rabin. And he wrote about it in his autobiography. And that was amazing for me to find that he wrote even about it, and not many people mentioned it. I mean, particularly in Hebrew. You will not find many sources who speak about, and he speaks about it that, okay, my soldiers didn't have any part in the war because the war was in Sinai against Egypt. And my soldiers in the north were bored. So there were still two villages there, Krad al-Baqqara and Krad al-Ghannami. With the collaboration even with the UN, we decided to expel them, 2,000 to 3,000 people, to Syria and to Jordan. So, and he thought that he's doing a very Zionist thing to get rid of Palestinians from the eastern part of the Galilee in 1956. So survival, as I said in the beginning of my answer, is not only survival of a genocide, of a Holocaust, but also a survival of a new conditions where the dominant party doesn't want you to stay there at all. But even if you stay in a very difficult conditions, and you have to survive and to find ways to live.
You're really talking about survival, not of an incident, but as a process, as a way of life in a way.
Sure.
Given all these difficult things that transpired and the difficulty of the situation for Palestinians who stayed in Israel, certainly under the military regime and all these threats and potential expulsions, it's very interesting that over the years, we never see a secessionist movement among the Palestinian citizens of Israel who wish to be elsewhere or to take their land and create a different state. There's no Kurdistan, no Catalonia here. How do you explain that?
I think the main reason for that is the balance of power between Israel and the Palestinians after 1948. Palestinians inside Israel were doubly marginal. Were marginal in the Israeli society and politics, but they were marginal also in the Palestinian national movement, not in the 50s, but in the 60s mainly. It took the Palestinians about 10 years after 1948 to start to reorganize their national movement, the PLO, and so on and so forth. And when the Palestinians started to write about what happened to them and to try to see a better future, for them, the Palestinians who stayed in Israel were suspicious. How come that they continue to survive under Israeli control? How come that the Jews are not expelling them? How come that their fate is different from the 700,000 Palestinians who became refugees? So at least they were suspected to be collaborators or something like that. Now, it took time for the Palestinian national movement to build up to begin with. And the Palestinians in Israel, who were still terrified from what happened in 1948, they have this trauma and post-trauma of the 1948, and they wanted only to survive, to stay put in their places. I think the literal book of Emil Habibi, Al-Mutasha'il, the optimist, is a wonderful story about what the people thought about. For instance, some of his sentences that somebody that the government expropriated half of their lands. So they said, wow, okay, we are lucky. They expropriated half of our land, but we still have the other half. If they, didn't let him go out and work in the city, neighboring city, he said, okay, we are lucky that we have some olives and some fig trees that we can live, we can survive. While the refugees in the refugee camps, they don't have their lands, they don't have their homes. So we are lucky. So all they wanted, at least, is to keep what they have and to prevent more pain from the Israeli side during that period.
All right, Dr. Adel Manna, this is all very interesting, but I'm afraid that we'll have to leave it there. You're a senior fellow at the Leer Institute, historian of modern Palestine, and the author most recently of Nakba and Survival, the story of the Palestinians who remained in Haifa in the Galilee 1948 to 1956. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. Also, we would like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Romei Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. Just like Blanche Dubois, the Tel Aviv Review relies on the kindness of strangers. So if you like our podcast and would like to help it survive, and be kind, please don't be a stranger. Drop us a line. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive on www.tlv1.fm/podcasts. There are more than 350 interviews to keep you busy. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.